Hey guys, this is a review for Chapter 27, the beginning of the Cold War. Now, World War II was the largest conflict in human history. Hopefully, it remains that way. When it was over, it was hard for anyone to really imagine what the world was going to be like afterwards. Everything for several years had been poured into the effort of World War II. Domestically, you're talking about rationing, victory gardens. Everyone's lives changed in the United States. Of course, that applies to a much greater degree in many other countries like Russia, which is the Soviet Union, like France, like Germany, where near total destruction of, and sometimes total destruction of cities, Japan, China. So World War II had been this war to end all wars type of war. And so psychologically, imagining what's coming next is very difficult. And the United States, being mostly physically removed from the war, though of course the United States endured a tremendous sacrifice as well. Thousands and thousands and thousands of Americans died fighting in World War II. The United States, relative to a lot of these other countries, will be in a much better place economically, socially. And so the United States will be able to take advantage of this situation and make itself an overwhelmingly powerful country. And what will emerge out of World War II will be really a bipolar world, bipolar in terms of, two sources of main power. You'll have the United States, which is really leading the capitalist, democratic world, and then you'll have the Soviet Union, which is leading the communist world. And those two factions will be in direct and indirect competition for the next several decades, right up until the 1990s. So this is about the genesis of that rivalry. And really the genesis of the rivalry does predate World War II, but what we term the Cold War begins very soon after World War II. So the three countries most responsible for Allied victory during the war, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, they're all going to disagree on what that world should be like in the future. The United Kingdom had a weakening empire. Remember, they had built a massive colonial empire around the world. World War II will be the nail in the coffin to that empire. Obviously, they don't want to lose it all at once. A lot of British don't want to lose it at all, but that's the perspective of the British at this point, a ever-decreasing global power. The United Kingdom, as a result of that, their big interest is maintaining the balance of power. Now, the United States has, though very close to the United Kingdom, very much a huge supporter and ally of the United Kingdom, does not like the idea of colonies. FDR, when he was alive and U.S. president, made it very clear that, hey, we're going to help you, we're going to be a leader in this war, but empire colonies needed to be a thing of the past. The United States will initially, I say initially because we're going to talk about some major changes due to the fear of communism later, but initially advocated for the removal of colonization to grant independence to some of the colonies of Britain. And so the United States really wanted democracy everywhere. It had decided that constitutional governments, which we call democracies a lot, but that's a misunderstood word, overused as well. But basically, republics where people have a say, there's a constitution in the government based on the rule of law with consent of the people. Capitalism, global market capitalism, just as important as anything else. Some would argue the most important. That was the perspective of the United States. Now, when it came to the Soviet Union, they wanted the spread of global communism. They saw capitalism as the root of many evils, and they believed before World War II that capitalism and the big empires that were capitalist, the United States, France, the United Kingdom, that they were already dead set on destroying communism. So it was sort of a combination of wanting to spread communism and also a very defensive mindset against capitalism. Certain things are going to take place during World War II that enhance that distrust between the capitalist world and the communist world. And you may think that, hey, well, the United States poured millions of dollars worth of aid into the Soviet Union. Wouldn't that have, made the relationship better? But other things, especially things that happened towards the end of the war, not only removed any sort of goodwill that the giving of supplies may have earned, but specifically with how the atomic bomb was handled and the usage of the atomic bomb, very, very controversial, and was done so in a way that made it quite obvious that the United States, part of the reason to use the bomb was as political leverage against the Soviet Union. Now, that's a complicated subject, and there's many pros and cons, or there's a lot of debate within that subject, but I can tell you that regardless of what one person may think is right or wrong or justifiable or not, the end result of how the atomic bomb was handled absolutely chilled the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, of course, the supreme focus for each of these countries during World War II was winning the war. But the way the war was won, the actions taken during the war, and the nuclear bomb thing that I mentioned, these go a long way to determine how the post-war world will look. The Soviet Union appeared determined to build up a very large security zone or a buffer zone. In other words, the Soviet Union, having been invaded again from the West, decided that it is necessary for its permanent safety to hold on to the areas that it, quote-unquote, liberated. Bordering the Soviet Union were countries like Poland, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, and nearby there were a lot of other countries that assisted Nazi Germany in trying to invade the Soviet Union. So from the Soviet Union's perspective, believing that the threat wasn't completely gone just because Nazi Germany had been defeated, they believed that they needed a buffer zone. Now, from the perspective of the United States, who was championing representative government, was championing capitalism, it didn't click well with that perspective. There would be an attempt from American political leadership. Harry Truman was the president after FDR, but there will be an attempt by Truman and his administration to convince the Soviet Union to allow open democratic governments in Eastern Europe. But the Soviet Union believed that it had assurances or implied assurances from FDR before he died that the Soviet Union would be granted that security zone. So from Stalin's perspective, one could argue that he believed that he was just continuing the understanding that was reached with FDR during World War II, and that Harry Truman was moving the goalposts. From Truman's perspective and the American perspective, whatever the United States decides, as long as it's not breaking any sort of treaty or written agreement, and as long as it's consistent with American values, that is completely fine to insist that the Soviets follow. In other words, the United States believed that what it was asking from the Soviet Union was righteous and correct, and that the Soviet Union was, instead of looking after its own interests, was being aggressive to take advantage of the situation. Now, of course, the United States is going to take advantage of the situation too, but depending on your perspective, one is less excusable than the other. So anyway, there's a lot of debate. The only reason I say all this isn't to confuse anyone, it's just to remind people, whatever country you live in, the odds are you're going to agree with that perspective. You're going to just assume that your country's perspective is correct, the other guy is the bad guy, the other guy has got the ulterior motives. It's useful to better understand history to realize that everyone is born into an environment where there is bias to one side or the other. So if your goal is to continue to believe what you already believe, then history is probably not the best thing for you. But if your goal is to try to understand what happened, what caused this, how things ended up the way they did, then the first step is recognizing bias, and the second step is trying to figure out how that may impact your analysis. So anyway, another thing worth pointing out is that the Cold War was set up by what happened during World War II. When a country or a group of countries is convinced that there is one effort that should be the priority and that all other things should be either put on hold or not really considered as important until that one effort is completed, like World War II, then you're going to plant seeds for other problems down the road. That's exactly what's going to happen with the Cold War, and it's also going to happen during the Cold War. Just to give a more recent perspective, a lot of things that the United States does during the Cold War will plant the seeds for 9/11, global terrorism, a lot of the controversy and strife that exists now. Of course, we'll cover those eventually. But it's just important to realize that, historically speaking, if you step back and you look at American foreign policy, solving one problem creates other problems, or at least the way the problems have been typically solved creates another problem. So instead of actually permanently solving a problem, you're really just trading one for another. But anyway, there's a million tons of specifics that give context to that particular line of thinking. All right, so how the Cold War started. Now, the suspicion from the Soviet Union towards Western powers, and remember, when I say Western powers, I'm talking about the United States, Britain, France. You may say, well, why not just say that? Well, it gets tedious to say all the countries every time. Western powers, associate that with capitalism, constitutional republics, democracy, that whole thing. So anyway, the suspicion from the Soviet Union towards the Western powers existed even before World War II. Ever since Western powers tried to help overthrow the Bolshevik government following World War I, the Soviet Union distrusted them. Now, even during the fight against Nazis, Stalin worked with the Allies, but always kept his hand close to his chest, meaning he revealed as little as possible. Americans detested the idea of communism. Bolsheviks. If you hear me say Bolshevik, don't let it throw you off. It is a particular strand of statist communism that served as the ideological inspiration for decisions made by the Soviet Union. In other words, when we talk about the ideology of the Soviet Union, like what values they had when they made their decisions, you can't just say communism, because there's theoretically dozens of versions of what that may look like. The specific version of communism is Bolshevism. It comes from Bolshevik, which draws its roots from the early revolution in Russia. There were different parties. There were Mensheviks, there were Bolsheviks. We're not going to get too deep into that, but when I say Bolshevism, I just mean the specific strand of communism that Stalin's Soviet Union used and identified with. Anyway, Bolsheviks detested capitalism. They saw it as evil. So mutual. And ideology does go a long way to explain this rivalry. Obviously, that's where a lot of the initial distrust comes from. But political events contributed to the intense rivalry as well. And that's always the case. Shortly following the war, the Soviet Union became aggressive in extending its influence, which is a nice way to put it, over countries in Eastern Europe. While the United Kingdom and the U.S. wanted European states to freely choose their own futures, obviously they favored capitalism and democracy, Stalin was dedicated to installing governments that were controlled by Moscow. The U.S. strategy that will develop out of all this is known as containment. Containment is an important concept here. If you have to try and isolate certain words that are more important than others, containment is one of those important words. So the United States couldn't really stop the Soviet Union. Not militarily. The Soviet army was huge. The amount of tanks that the Soviet Union had was just so far beyond what the United States could hope to deal with. It's impractical and probably impossible to have a strategy of, well, let's go defeat the Soviet Union because we don't like what they're doing. So containment rather than rollback would be kicking them out, or having a policy that forces them out. Containment. Don't let them go any further. Basically say, all right, fine, you got away with what you got away with. That's it. That will be the essence of American strategy under Truman. And there are other elements of that, too, we'll talk about. Soviet expansion and the Truman Doctrine, another important concept here. Not only did the Soviet Union force many Eastern European countries to set up pro-Bolshevik governments, they also pressured formerly neutral states like Turkey and Iran to make territorial and economic concessions. So also in Greece, there was a civil war, and that broke out in 1947, very brutal civil war. And that was between pro-Western forces, so like pro-capitalism, pro-democracy. Well, not necessarily pro-democracy. We'll just say definitely anti-communists, and then communists. The British backed the democratic government, but ran out of money because they're going broke, and they already had been broke. And so they asked the United States to take over. So the United States, now deeply involved in the affairs of the rest of the world, was being begged by the United Kingdom to protect democracy in Greece. And Truman had been convinced that without American foreign aid to places like Greece or Turkey, that communism and Stalin's version of tyranny would spread. So Truman went to Congress, convinced them to release funds to help stabilize the situation for democracy. That is, invest in military groups and other forms of U.S. aid to increase the likelihood of a pro-capitalist, pro-democratic outcome in some of these civil wars, especially Greece. So at this point in American history, Truman decided that the United States had the duty to protect democracy around the world or face the eventual destruction of freedom from an ideological threat. So when people ask the question, when did the United States become police of the world? Nowadays we're in there nearly every country. We're always in some sort of low intensity conflict, in undeclared wars, or the police of the universe. When did that really start? Well, of course, we talked about imperialism and when the United States became very much involved in what goes on around the world and what other countries are doing politically and economically. Well, the moment that the United States decided that it couldn't just deal with things in its own borders. It had to go around the world, or eventually the threat would continue and grow to the point where the United States couldn't defend itself. So this is that moment, the Truman Doctrine. So the United States decided to give aid and take responsibility for many global flashpoints, that is, places in the world that are like a hot spot for a civil war or confrontation between anti-communist and communist forces. So fighting communism became the American political issue. All right, so in that context, let's talk about the Marshall Plan, which is very, very important. The Marshall Plan is named after the Secretary of State, who used to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during World War II, George C. Marshall. It was decided that even though communism was a global phenomenon, Europe was the most important part of the world, and that's so typically an American perspective. So the United States doesn't have the resources, which means no one had the resources, to contain the Soviet Union equally everywhere. That if the United States was going to make a really realistic go at this, they had to focus in on what they determined was most important, and Europe was considered most important. And that means Asia was put on the back burner. Now, Europe, obviously devastated by the war, hadn't even fully recovered from World War I, thoroughly, much more devastated by World War II. People starved. Electricity did not run in many places for long periods of time. The economy, the supply chains, you had a tremendous amount of suffering and despair going on in Europe. You may anticipate what I'm about to say, but if you didn't, here it goes. More suffering, more economic devastation simply makes a certain population group more likely to reach for an extreme. And during this time, the extreme that was promising a better life was talking about how, capitalism insulates the rich and it exposes the poor and the working class to all the suffering. That type of argument becomes much more appealing if it's hard for you to find your next meal, if your future is very bleak. So the simple math equation is more suffering equals more sympathy for communism. So the Marshall Plan was an idea to take a massive American investment into Europe to bring up their economies, to reduce suffering, and almost like a vaccine against communism. So in June 1947, Secretary of State George C. Marshall announced his recovery plan. The European recovery was labeled as a humanitarian effort, but more importantly, it was seen as the best way to protect capitalism and democracy in that part of the world. A stable Europe also tremendously helped the American economy because it meant there were plenty of customers for American goods, so it's a double whammy. Now, a really clever bit of this strategy was that the United States actually tried to leave the door open for Eastern European countries and even the Soviet Union to cooperate in this whole endeavor. But as predicted, the Soviet Union resisted and even blocked countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia from participating. The United States knew that the Soviet Union wouldn't like this because it seemed to suggest that the American way was the better way, and if the Soviet Union wanted to hold on to that buffer zone, it couldn't allow something so obviously beneficial from the West, from the United States, to happen. But of course, people around the world are going to notice this, so it really made the United States look a lot more well-meaning than the Soviet Union. It was a very clear example of, hey, here's some economic aid. We will even let you participate. Why wouldn't you want to participate in economic aid? And then why would you block others from getting help unless you had ulterior motives? So it was a good PR coup for the United States. All right, so let's talk about the Soviet response. Now, the Soviet Union made it pretty clear what exactly their role in world affairs would be. In 1947, the Soviet Union ignored local elections in Hungary, which is one of the former allies of Nazi Germany, who they were now occupying their land after the war. And they overthrew their government and established a puppet government. And of course, a puppet government, just like it sounds, you're dangling the strings. It's a local government in name, but it is still pretty much controlled by Moscow, the capital of Russia, which is the Soviet Union. All right, now in 1948, the same type of thing happened in Czechoslovakia, and so an organization will be set up called the Communist Information Bureau, and this specific purpose of this bureau was tying the communist satellite states together and making them toe the party line. So if you know anything about Greek history, sort of like the Delian League, this is not a perfect comparison, maybe like the United States and NATO, which we'll talk about NATO later. I don't want to cause confusion. Basically, the Soviet Union set up these countries that were supposed to look like they were governing themselves, and they just so happened to be friendly to the Soviet Union. But in reality, the Soviet Union set up states that were obedient to them. If they weren't obedient, then the Soviet Union wouldn't allow that to continue. So satellite states, just basically like, all right, they're on the periphery, they do what we say. So you may hear me say puppet state, satellite state. The struggle over Germany, all right? Now, after World War II, Germany was split up into zones of control, like occupation zones. France, the United States, and the United Kingdom, they would have their own zones of responsibility in the western part of Germany, while the Soviet Union would control the east. Now, Berlin is the capital of Germany. This is in the east, but the city itself is actually going to be split up so that the Soviet Union doesn't have control of the most important city all by itself. So what happens is that right in the middle of the eastern half of Germany, there was a little cutout of Berlin, and then a map very similar to how Germany was split up. You had, the United States, Britain, and France, and then the Soviet Union, where, you're going to have that same setup in Berlin itself. So it's like a microcosm of the country. Now, as the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union deteriorated and distrust took over, both sides moved towards considering their half of Germany to be a permanent situation. Eventually, a new West German state is going to be set up. And then as a response, on June 24th, 1948, the Soviet Union decided to cut off the land route to Berlin in order to force the Allies to evacuate. They thought that, hey, if they can't keep supplying the city, they can't get soldiers in and out. One, they're definitely not going to declare war over this because we have the tremendous upper hand. And two, the only alternative is for them to leave. Of course, the United States had a trick up its sleeve, or really, I don't know if we can call it a trick, but a tremendous logistical effort that was once thought to be completely impossible. Now, instead of evacuating, the United States accepted this challenge and stayed put. Now, some generals wanted the army to simply go to war over this issue, but this would have likely triggered a disaster. The Soviets didn't have a nuke yet. They will soon. But they're only, they will have it in a year. But the Red Army, the Soviet Army, was massive, and a land battle over Berlin would have led to World War III. But without supplies, the people of West Berlin would eventually starve to death. So the Americans decided to fly in supplies. And like I said, it seemed impossible at the time, but the United States pulled it off. 13,000 tons of supplies were brought in a day. Okay, so that's 26 million pounds of supplies. The Soviets eventually backed down because they didn't want war either, and in May 1949, they lifted the blockade. But this made the split of Germany permanent. So let's talk about NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Now, strangely, NATO still exists, even though the Warsaw Pact does not. So let's get into why they were established. Now that tensions were extremely high, the United States became determined to appear strong in the face of what they perceived as Soviet aggression. So by 1949, the United States and Canada joined with Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands and Luxembourg to establish NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and that's a mutual defense pact against the Soviet Union and against further Soviet expansion. So for the first time in American history, the United States entered into a rigid peacetime alliance which could automatically trigger a war if certain criteria are met. This goes against previous American ideals about not becoming involved too heavily in foreign wars, but at the time it was seen as necessary to safeguard against the crisis of Soviet expansion. So you see another example of a crisis causing the United States to very quickly do something that goes against original ideals. The Soviet Union will set up a similar organization to counteract NATO. That's the Warsaw Pact, and that was basically just the Soviet Union and their communist satellite states. Let's talk about atomic diplomacy. The United States had to consider the possibility of war involving nuclear weapons. While that may seem like a distant thing now, like it's impossible, it could never happen, one, it can. But anyway, at the time when nukes were new, there was much more thought about this is eventually going to happen, we need to be ready for it, we might need to use it. There were many, many more examples where a general or a politician or maybe even the American public would think that a nuclear weapon being actually used was a good thing. I mean, remember, they were used on Japan. So with a potential war using nuclear weapons, that raises a lot of questions. For instance, who should make the choice to use the bomb? I mean, it's a weapon and the military has it, so should it be a military commander, like when they decide, hey, we're going to use artillery versus something else? The military leadership has the ability to sort of decide what weapons they're going to use. But the nuke, that's a different ballgame. So who does the military decide? Does civilian leadership decide? Now, what circumstances would justify using the bomb? Is it just, hey, anytime we have a war, all right, now we have a nuke, that just makes us better at fighting a war? Or is it something the United States should hold in reserve except for an emergency? There's a lot of unanswered questions going on. So the United States determined that dropping another nuke could only be authorized by civilian political leadership, the president. So, of course, that's another way that the president has become way more powerful. But the control over the nuclear question was still not complete. The military and the elected government struggled for more authority over this issue during the early Cold War. Now, I'm going to show you a clip from one of the greatest movies of all time, in my opinion, Dr. Strangelove. And it's going to give you some examples of the logic that were used in how to determine when to use it, who should use it. And it's a very specific scenario that could have happened. That it was fictional, didn't happen, or you probably would have heard about it. Probably. I'm going to give you some clips, and then I'm going to give you an assignment specifically for those clips. So you don't have to watch the whole movie, even though I would be doing you a favor if I made everyone do that. That assignment will come later, but it's relevant to this section here. The United States, for a while, not too long, was the only country in the world with nuclear weapons. And of course, the United States was very pleased with that scenario, and of course refused to give up the advantage by allowing some international agency to oversee its program. That was not going to happen. And so by not doing that, by not bringing other countries in, by sort of holding it as leverage, of course, that meant there was going to be an arms race. And so that's exactly what will occur. So the next section is nuclear deterrence. Deterrence is a very, very important concept that a lot of people take for granted or they don't really think about. So you can have a weapon and the value of that weapon isn't limited to when you use it. You could have a weapon so powerful, so scary, that by having it, you deter other people from even doing something that they may have otherwise done. And so nuclear deterrence, for that reason, is a big deal. A good analogy would be, if there is a criminal, and the criminal, their thing is they like breaking in homes, and there's two choices. Of course, this is a made-up scenario. Both houses have a lot of stuff, okay? But there's one house where family doesn't like guns, they don't have any, they know for sure somehow that they don't have any guns, and then the other family, they have an arsenal. They're loaded. Everybody knows how to shoot. It's very obvious that that's there. Well, the criminal is, unless they've got a death wish, they're probably going to pick the easier target. So nuclear deterrence works in a similar way, just on a larger scale. By 1949, Soviet spies and nuclear scientists had led the Soviet Union to create their own atomic bomb. The United States believed that atomic weapons were at the core of their military strategy. So this is a big deal. So the United States will drastically reduce its army to a very small force so that, the budget can eventually be balanced again. And it was nearly certain that the United States in a conventional war against the Soviet Union could not win, not on a neutral site. But to compensate for that, the United States will build up its air force and its nuclear force. So nuclear deterrence is now going to be the main strategy of national defense. That is, have so many nuclear weapons that you could blow the world up multiple times, and that is not hyperbole. That is literally the case now. So you don't have to have a huge army. You can just say, hey, if you do this, we're going to nuke you, which of course that ups the ante in terms of a standoff between two countries. So the specific way that the United States tried to achieve deterrence was something called massive retaliation doctrine. This was the threat that if anyone attacked the United States or any of our allies, or maybe some other things that we might specify later, the United States would retaliate with its entire nuclear arsenal. So no halfway measures. There's a line, a red line. If you cross it, total nuclear war, which hopefully no one wants. So in order for that to work. So far, no one has. Now, this is not just a threat for retaliation if the United States was nuked itself. This is also if, like, the Soviet Union invaded West Germany. If you invade West Germany, Soviet Union, we're going to nuke you. And so this was such a powerful threat, it was believed that no one would dare test it. But if they did, to be specific, there was a plan to nuke 20 Soviet cities if the Soviets attacked Western Europe by any means. So, I mean, you could argue like maybe it was a bluff. The nukes were real. They were really pointed at the stuff. There were specific plans to use them. There was training on those plans, so, I mean, who knows? Now, this deterrence thing seemed to work, and the containment, the Truman Doctrine, it seemed to be working as, like, for instance, Greece, Turkey, and Iran, all those outcomes were not favorable to the communist side. The communism seems to have receded somewhat, and the expansion seemed to have stopped. And to sort of bolster that, Western Europe seemed on its way toward total economic recovery. So obviously that made the likelihood for people to turn to communism even lower. So the United States was convinced it had to remain vigilant all around the world and keep the threat of nuclear war on the table or else risk world domination by communism. So let's talk about prosperity at home. Now, another one of the big stories in American history is how World War II got the United States out of the Great Depression. That's debatable, though it is a very common, the most common view. So let's talk about, prosperity at home. The United States would experience a prolonged period of prosperity after World War II that would really last until like 1970 or the 1970s. A couple of reasons why, other than the common story about government spending got the United States out of the Depression. The United States was not destroyed, Europe was destroyed, and the United States was able to position itself as the only show in town for a lot of these countries. While much of Europe was destroyed, the United States enjoyed a near monopoly in producing a lot of the goods. So American products and American culture will fill the void left by the decline of much of the rest of the world. Also, there's something called Bretton Woods, which was an agreement that a lot of the world's countries made with the United States. And basically, most of the world pegged their currency to the dollar. That is, the dollar, which was still backed by gold, though in a weird way, at that point, was made the world reserve currency. And that countries would decide how much money they needed in their economy based on the dollar. And so, obviously, that put the United States in probably an unprecedented global economic advantage. And the amount of immense leverage coming out of that situation, it was huge. So I can post more information about Bretton Woods because it's extremely important. Also, there's a lot of new technology that resulted from the war, and that's going to lead to a huge increase in worker productivity. In my opinion, the biggest one, and I say my opinion, I don't say that with everything I say, but this one I do, is that there was a lot of pent-up consumer demand. If you think about the rationing from the war from 1942 to 1945, people weren't allowed to buy cars for a long time. People weren't allowed to buy nearly anything that they normally had. Silk, food was rationed. So there's a lot of pent-up consumer demand. And even before the war, if you think of it, there was the Great Depression. People had saved and rationed, they went without. And now the United States was flush with money, and stores were filled with excess goods. And the result was a massive consumption spree, and that's what our economy is based on. And you can see that with what's going on with the reaction to COVID-19 right now. It's not so much that, hey, we're not making as much money. It's that when the economy stops, the system starts to break, and who knows what's going to happen. But if you don't have continued consumption, this system doesn't work. It's not like it just, well, it's not quite as good. It's like, no, it'll break. We'll see how that goes. The next section is not a boom for everyone. So I mentioned, most Americans experienced a very nice standard of living and a very nice prolonged economic boom, but that was really white America. So white America was doing really well after the war, but minorities still found in many cases that they lived in a society that disrespected them and treated them as unequal. President Truman did move to finally desegregate the armed forces, and several other attempts are going to be made by the federal government to reduce unequal treatment of blacks, especially in the South. But Southern senators made civil rights reform extremely difficult, primarily with the filibuster. Now, some progress was made in urban centers like Atlanta, but the countryside was a totally different story. The same old mix of intimidation, violence, bias laws, these things are going to keep blacks from achieving equality over most of the South. Now, in the North, towns were segregated as well, but instead of official segregation, this was default segregation. So tension, which did still exist up north, noticeably less than in the South because whites and blacks lived closer to one another, whereas whites up north, who had had more money even in previous generations, they had all moved out of the cities and moved away. And so again, there was more default segregation up north. So demographics in a very large area were very different. You would have like 99% white in a whole county. Whereas in the South, since the South had been traditionally poorer, you did not have that. You had people living right next to one another. Let's talk about the next wave of the Red Scare. In 1949, the United States discovered that the Soviet Union had their own nuclear weapons, which was very scary. You've got communists, which are already, boogeymen and scary. And then you've got communists with nuclear weapons now, so it's like inconceivable. What made it worse is it became clear that spies living in the United States were very important for the Soviet effort. It was found that at least hundreds of spies had been funneling top secret info to Moscow during and after World War II. And the paranoia only grew when the world's most populous country went communist too. China. China had been in a very bloody civil war between what are called nationalists, which is an oversimplification, and communists, which might be also an oversimplification. But anyway, the Chinese that the Americans had been allied with lost the civil war, and they fled to Taiwan, which is the genesis of this whole Taiwan issue, if you've ever heard of that. If you notice, the nationalist Chinese flag under Chiang Kai-shek is actually the Taiwanese flag now. So that's part of the reason that's an issue, is that for a long time the United States said, well, no, the real China is in Taiwan, and the China in China is fake China. We don't acknowledge them. Anyway, it's more complicated than that. Now, politics actually helped make the fear of communism at home worse. Now, to convince voters to support the Republican Party, Harry Truman, who was a Democrat, was painted as soft on communism. And so Truman was politically motivated to prove his critics wrong. And so Truman established a lot of programs to sort of show, like, I'm clearly anti-communist, at least as much as anyone else. So, things like that happen all the time. It can be politically useful. For instance, like how people talking about China now with COVID-19, regardless of what the facts are, I'm not claiming to have one opinion or another, but the situation is it's always politically useful for one side to be like, well, they're not anti-China enough, they're not anti-Russian enough, and it works on people. So anyway, that absolutely was going on in this case. Truman is going to establish something called the Federal Employee Loyalty Program, which sounds scary to me, but with the way things are going, who knows? Something like that may come back. This program was to hunt down and root out, quote, Reds, phonies, and parlor pinks. So communists, spies, and people who sympathize with communism, pink instead of red. Now this, of course, was eventually abused. Duh. People could be fired without any hearing at all, any evidence at all. Also, the House Committee of Un-American Activities, I did not make that up, this is going to be set up for similar purposes. Certain elected officials saw Hollywood as a mouthpiece for communism, and so actors had their pasts looked into. They were investigated to see if they had any pro-communist or pro-Soviet activities. Now that's problematic because during World War II, when the United States was acting all nice with the Soviet Union for practical reasons, there was actually some pro-Soviet propaganda from the government, or not pro-communist, but basically things like that were opened up. Actors felt comfortable to join a communist group or maybe the Communist Party during that time. But that window not only closed quickly, but then people who may have done that, it was used against them later. So some actors were even put in jail for simply refusing to answer whether or not they had ever been a communist, which is totally unconstitutional. But again, very few people care about the Constitution whenever there's a crisis or they're scared or they think some emergency is going on. It's like, oh, okay, well, we only have a Constitution when things are going well, which what's the point of that? Of course, purging parties, they always get out of control. And so eventually, like homosexuals, they're going to be targeted for their corrosive impact on fellow employees. Basically, what ends up developing is that this idea of communism, which of course is nebulous already, gets attached to all these other things that people don't like. And so people start to make these connections between, if they're homophobic or something, they'll say like, well, really, homosexuality has its origins in communism, and atheism is communist. And basically anything that goes against your values, people say communist. And you still sometimes hear the elderly, if they're really mad at someone they disagree with, they might seriously yell at them that they're a communist. Not to pick on elderly, I'm just saying it's a generational thing. So that's, nowadays if someone yells communist at someone, it's typically a joke. I mean, I do it all the time, and I don't think anyone takes me seriously. Anyway, with all this being said about the Red Scare, we have to talk about Senator McCarthy, the typical example of this type of paranoid, abusive behavior. Senator McCarthy thrived in this environment of fear and paranoia. Citing next to no specifics, no evidence, McCarthy continuously claimed he had a list, and he'd hold it up, a list of hundreds of communists, he would call them card-carrying communists, who worked in the United States government. Now, this guy was especially annoying because when he was cornered to substantiate his claims, he almost always changed the subject, or he lied, or he would accuse someone of being communist for daring to question him. And that line of thinking goes like, well, I'm aggressively out here trying to hunt down communists. Why would you try to slow me down? Why would you tell me that I'm not right? Are you communist? So that type of thing works on people. It works on people. And of course they don't realize it, but anyway. McCarthy was the voice of those who had a strong dislike for things considered foreign or effeminate, communist, atheist, homosexual, socially liberal, pretty much any concept that was considered against someone's version of American values. If you're really suspicious of people who are different than you and you feel like something should be done to them because of how different their values are, then McCarthy is your guy. It would take years before enough Americans became fed up with him to stop McCarthy. He turned on those who questioned him or denied his authority to witch hunt. He even started investigating the army for communism after they resisted his probes. In 1954, the Senate finally had enough and publicly reprimanded him. It's a great video when he's finally confronted, because everybody was so scared of him, but he overplayed his hand. The next section, the military-industrial complex. Now, this is going to be another assignment of its own. I'm going to have a couple videos and an assignment for you to do, and you'll have until really the end. We're almost at the end of the semester, so you'll have pretty much until the end of the semester to turn it in. But don't procrastinate, because that will hurt your grade probably. It is hard to overstate the suffocating fear that the Cold War caused in the United States. Now, as a result of this fear, defense spending increased from $13 billion to $50 billion. That's still a tiny fraction of what it is now. Now, of course, taxes are going to be raised to pay for this, but also the government will go into debt to pay for this. And we talked about the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve will just simply print money and devalue other money in order to help pay for this as well. So you got the three ways to do this. Now, though this was somewhat controversial at first, a new war will wipe the opposition to larger defense budgets away. Now, not only that, but for the first time in American history, there will be a permanent military industry which will have its own very heavy influence. And so this is why when President Eisenhower, who was a general, he was an overall Allied commander in Europe during World War II, so he knew his military stuff. He warned the American people directly about the military-industrial complex. He warned people that because of this new situation, if Americans aren't careful and they're not paying attention, that this very powerful entity will have political influence that it should not have. It will have influence over society that it should not have, and that it's a very dangerous scenario if people are not paying attention, and especially if they're not aware of it, which pretty much no one is now. And so again, I'm going to post another assignment just for that, but know This is the context of the military-industrial complex. So the last thing we're going to cover for Chapter 27 is the Korean War. During the 40s and the early 50s, the vast majority of Americans knew very little about Korea. Many had never heard of it. Now, before World War II, Japan had owned and brutally exploited Korea as a colony. After World War II, Korea had been split in the middle because Soviet forces defeated Japan in the northern half and occupied it after the war. The United States did the same in the south. So separate governments are going to develop, just like in Germany. Now, the North Korean leader, Kim Il-sung, will pretty much beg Stalin over a period of months to allow him to invade South Korea. North Korea had developed a military faster than South Korea, and he believed that he could go ahead and unify the whole peninsula, have one Korea again under communist leadership. Stalin said no several times. Eventually, Stalin will believe that the United States won't intervene because, again, they're so focused on Europe, which wasn't an entirely stupid thought, but he turned out to be wrong. On June 25th, 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea and nearly did totally defeat them. It was very close. The United States saw the invasion as a sign that the Soviet Union was committed to forcing communism on the rest of the world wherever it could get away with it. It didn't really see this as North Koreans wanting this. It saw it as, puppet master Soviet Union doing all the decision making here. So Truman's administration decided, and remember, they're egged on by the whole political thing where you have to be strong on communism. But and he may have decided this anyway. I don't want to make it sound like that's the only reason. I'm just saying it's relevant to consider. Truman's administration decided that the United States had to act or communism would continue to spread. And so the United States actually got international approval from the UN. There's something it doesn't really feel it needs to do anymore, and sent its own forces in to help South Korea. Now, the Americans got involved just in time because South Korea was nearly totally overrun. Now, under General Douglas MacArthur, the United States planned a maneuver that was meant to turn the tide. And this was an amphibious landing at Incheon. The United States was able to kick North Korea out of South Korea, but instead of stopping at the old border, Douglas MacArthur pushed on, and he did so very, very aggressively. He believed that the United States may actually have an opportunity to defeat the North and do the opposite of what the North wanted and unify all of Korea under a democracy or under South Korea. Now, as the United States approached the border with China, China threatened the United States and said, "We will intervene if you continue." And MacArthur essentially ignored this and continued to push UN forces, which were mostly American, northward, right up against the Chinese border. Now, the Chinese military secretly infiltrated the border and on November 25th, attacked American forces, sending them into a desperate retreat. Chosin Reservoir is one of the worst stories in American history. Very sad. A lot of Americans needlessly died there. The American general at the time, Douglas MacArthur, he was extremely popular. He wanted to actually expand the war into China. He even called for nuking China. And President Truman, convinced that Asia wasn't the real center of the Cold War, he worried that an escalation there may lead to a war with the Soviets just when things started to get better in Europe. And so Truman refused to allow this. Now, MacArthur actually started to publicly criticize the president over this, and this was a constitutional crisis because, there's a chain of command, and MacArthur seemed to be going outside of it. And so a power struggle will actually develop between the commander-in-chief and this very popular, powerful general. Eventually, the UN forces pulled together to stop the Chinese counterattack, slowly turning the tide at the last minute, and pretty much the war is going to end in the same place it started. Truman offered a truce with China and North Korea, basically to restore the old border. But MacArthur, at this point, stepped outside the chain of command and threatened China to make peace or be attacked. And so at that point, Truman fired MacArthur. The war dragged on for 2 more years before ending in a stalemate. Now, after all the deaths, there were 37,000 American deaths, 776 casualties from all of the Allied nations, and who knows how many. There were millions of deaths with civilians on the North Korean side. But after all that fighting, the 38th parallel ended up being the border, and the border has been heavily guarded ever since.